Picture this. It's the blazing summer of 1867, and you're a 23-year-old Comanche warrior named Yellow Wolf, racing for your life across the Texas plains. Behind you, Pawnee scouts are closing in, their war cries echoing off the limestone bluffs near the Brazos River. Ahead of you, your war party is strung out in a desperate retreat, and you're watching something that will haunt your dreams for the rest of your life. Your wounded brothers are falling behind. Now, if you've never seen a traditional travois in action, imagine trying to evacuate a modern battlefield using nothing but stretchers dragged behind bicycles. That's essentially what Plains tribes had been doing for generations. 2 long poles tied to a horse, with a hide platform suspended between them, bouncing and lurching across every rock, every prairie dog hole, every piece of rough ground. It worked fine for moving camp at a leisurely pace, but in a running fight, it was a death sentence. Yellow Wolf watched helplessly as warrior after warrior, men who had ridden beside him since childhood, made the terrible calculation that every Plains Indian understood. The wounded couldn't keep up. The travois moved too slowly, and if you stayed with them, everyone died. So they left them. Think about that for a moment. These weren't just fellow soldiers in Comanche society. These were brothers, cousins, the sons of elders who had trusted Yellow Wolf to bring their boys home, and he was abandoning them to scalping knives and torture because their transportation technology hadn't evolved since their great-grandfather's time. That night, camped in a hidden draw 20 miles from the ambush site, Yellow Wolf did something that would change the course of Plains Indian history. He ate peyote buttons and sought a vision. Now, peyote visions weren't just spiritual experiences for the Comanche, they were serious business, a way of accessing knowledge that the conscious mind couldn't reach. Think of it like a combination of prayer, meditation, and consulting the world's most experienced engineer, all rolled into one. And what Yellow Wolf saw that night would make modern NASA engineers nod in appreciation. He saw horses running like the wind itself, not galloping, running with a smoothness that seemed to defy physics. Behind them, sacred bundles floated just above the earth, barely touching the ground, moving at speeds that should have torn apart any traditional travois. In his vision, he watched willow wood bending like a bow but never breaking, buffalo sinew stretching and contracting like living muscle, and most importantly, a weight distributed across multiple points instead of dragging from just 2. When Yellow Wolf woke up, he started drawing in the dirt. The other warriors thought he'd lost his mind. Gray Beard, a respected elder who had counted coup against both Texans and Mexicans, took one look at Yellow Wolf's sketches and called them the Fool's Burden. The design looked impossible. Where traditional travois used 2 rigid poles, Yellow Wolf's vision showed a flexible frame that could bend and twist. Where the old designs concentrated all the weight on the horse's haunches, his distributed it across the animal's entire body. But here's the thing about desperate young men with impossible ideas. They tend to be very, very persistent. For 3 entire moons, while Gray Beard and the other warriors shook their heads, Yellow Wolf worked. He experimented with different woods, testing how thin he could shave willow branches before they snapped. He studied buffalo sinew like a medieval bowyer, learning exactly how much stretch each strand could handle. He observed how prairie grass bent in the wind but sprang back, how river willows swayed in floods but survived while rigid oak trees snapped. Most importantly, he watched horses. Really watched them. He noticed how a horse's gait changed when pulling different loads, how the animal's entire body could become part of the pulling mechanism if the weight was distributed correctly. Modern biomechanics engineers spend years studying these same principles, but Yellow Wolf figured them out by pure observation and desperate necessity. The other warriors started calling him crazy. They had a point. Here was a young man spending all his time weaving sticks together like an old woman making baskets, claiming he could build something that would revolutionize warfare itself. In 1867, if you suggested that a Comanche warrior's greatest contribution to history might involve interior decorating techniques, people would have laughed you out of camp. They weren't laughing when the test came. It was during a raid on a remote Texas settlement the kind of lightning strike that Comanche war parties had perfected over generations. Get in fast, take what you can, get out before the Rangers arrive. But something went wrong. There were more armed settlers than expected, and Yellow Wolf's younger brother, Spotted Eagle, took an arrow through the shoulder. Not a minor wound, either. We're talking about a barbed iron arrowhead that had punched through muscle and was grinding against bone with every movement. In traditional circumstances, this meant one of two things. Either the war party slowed down to accommodate the wounded man and risked being caught by pursuing cavalry, or they left him behind to die. Yellow Wolf had a third option. As the thunder of approaching horses grew louder, and we're talking about professional cavalry here, not some local militia, Yellow Wolf hitched his experimental travois to his fastest horse and loaded his semi-conscious brother into what the other warriors were still calling the fool's burden. What happened? Next entered Comanche legend. Yellow Wolf raced 15 miles without stopping. Not 15 miles of careful walking, not 15 miles of cautious trotting, 15 miles of flat-out running across terrain that would challenge a modern all-terrain vehicle. His brother, secure in the swaying cradle that moved like part of the horse itself, arrived at the rendezvous point, conscious, stable, and ready to fight again within a week. The pursuing cavalry never even came close. Word spread through the camps like prairie fire in August. Windwalker, I.M., because that's what they started calling him, had done something that seemed to violate the fundamental laws of physics and warfare. He had conquered distance itself, but here's where the story gets really interesting. Because what Yellow Wolf had actually done was something far more profound than just building a better stretcher. He had accidentally invented the foundation for what would become the last great military advantage of the Plains tribes, and the United States Army was about to find out exactly what that meant. You know what's fascinating about revolutionary technology? It's never just about the technology itself. It's about how it changes everything else, the way people live, love, fight, and dream. And Yellow Wolf's travois? It didn't just change how the Comanche moved their wounded. It transformed the entire fabric of Plains Indian civilization in ways that nobody, not even Windwalker himself, could have predicted. Within 2 seasons, and we're talking about a society where major changes usually took generations to spread, Yellow Wolf's design had revolutionized life across what the Spanish called Comancheria, and that vast empire of grass that stretched from Kansas to Mexico. But here's the thing that really gets me. It wasn't the warriors who drove this revolution. It was the women. Think about it from a Comanche woman's perspective in 1868. For centuries, your great-grandmothers had been breaking camp the same way. Hours of back-breaking labor, loading heavy travois that fought you every step of the way, knowing that a slow departure could mean death if enemies were approaching. Then suddenly, this young warrior shows up with a design that cuts your work time in half. The women didn't just adopt Yellow Wolf's travois. They perfected it. They developed packing methods that would make modern logistics experts weep with envy, techniques passed from mother to daughter with the same reverence that warriors shared coup stories. They figured out how to balance loads so precisely that a fully loaded travois could navigate terrain that would challenge an unladen horse. They created modular systems where different components could be swapped out depending on whether you were moving a family's entire household or just carrying supplies for a hunting party. But the real revolution wasn't in how they packed, it was in where they could go. Young couples from distant bands could now court properly, traveling 50 miles for a single dance and returning by dawn. Think about what that meant for genetic diversity, for cultural exchange, for the simple human joy of falling in love with someone from beyond your immediate circle. Marriages that once required complex negotiations between bands separated by weeks of travel could now be arranged with the spontaneity of a modern road trip. Medicine Man Black Sky was among the first to grasp the deeper implications. This elderly holy man, who had been carrying sacred bundles to ceremonial gatherings for over 30 years, arrived at the Great Summer Council of 1869, looking fresher than warriors half his age. He had travelled 200 miles in 5 days, his precious medicine bundles secure in a specially adapted travois that kept them stable and protected. Other medicine men took notice. Within a year, Spiritual leaders across the southern plains were commissioning their own sacred travois, spreading religious practices and ceremonial knowledge at unprecedented speed. The innovation didn't stop with the Comanche either. At the Great Trade Gathering of 1871, 2024, imagine a combination of medieval fair, diplomatic summit, and technology transfer conference, all happening on the open prairie. Kiowa craftsmen offered 20 horses for the construction secrets. 20 horses, in a society where a good war pony might be worth more than a modern luxury car, this was like offering a small fortune for blueprints. But Yellow Wolf wasn't interested in getting rich. He was interested in spreading the design to anyone who could use it to save lives. Apache runners carried sketches into the mountains of New Mexico, where tribal engineers adapted the flexible frame design for narrow mountain trails. The Cheyenne, dealing with the harsh terrain of their northern territories, added antelope horn reinforcements that could handle impacts with rocks and fallen timber. The Arapaho, masters of mountain warfare, created collapsible versions that could be disassembled and carried through passes too narrow for traditional travois. Each tribe made the design their own, but the core principles remained the same: flexibility, weight distribution, and speed that seemed to defy physics. The most dramatic transformation came in hunting. For generations, plains tribes had been limited by a cruel mathematical reality. You could only take as much buffalo meat as your travois could carry back to camp at traditional speeds. This meant leaving enormous amounts of protein to rot on the prairie, even during times when the band was facing hunger. Yellow Wolf's design changed that equation completely. Hunting parties could now follow buffalo herds for hundreds of miles, striking quickly when the moment was right and transporting more meat than ever before. They could set up temporary camps, process entire animals on site, and haul the results back to the main band before the meat spoiled. Some hunting expeditions started bringing specially trained travois teams, think of them as the 1870s equivalent of cargo aircraft, that could evacuate the results of a successful hunt in a matter of hours rather than days. The psychological impact was just as profound as the practical benefits. For the first time in living memory, Plains Indians felt like they were ahead of the curve technologically. While white settlers were still using ox-drawn wagons that moved at a pace that would embarrass a modern traffic jam, Comanche war parties were covering ground at speeds that made cavalry officers rethink their entire tactical doctrine. Chief Quanah Parker himself recognized the military implications immediately. This remarkable leader, half Comanche, half white, 100% tactical genius, IK, commissioned a war travois decorated with scalps and eagle feathers that became famous across the southern plains. He used it during the Second Battle of Adobe Walls in 1874 to rescue 14 wounded warriors from under the noses of buffalo hunters armed with long-range rifles. The sight of Quanah's war travois racing across open ground, seemingly immune to rifle fire because of its incredible speed, became the stuff of legend on both sides of the conflict. But perhaps the most significant change was in the rhythm of plains life itself. What once took a moon's travel could now be accomplished in a week. Families scattered by warfare could reunite in days rather than seasons. News traveled at the speed of the fastest horse rather than the pace of the slowest travois. The impossible became routine. Yellow Wolf, now known throughout Comancheria as Windwalker, found himself in the strange position of being a celebrity in a culture that traditionally valued warriors above inventors. Young men sought him out not for war stories, but for engineering advice. Women brought him design problems their grandmothers would never have imagined solving. He had become something new in Plains Indian society, technological innovator whose ideas mattered as much as his courage in battle. But even as his travois spread across the southern plains like wildfire, darker clouds were gathering on the horizon. The same speed and mobility that made Yellow Wolf's design so revolutionary for plains tribes made them far more dangerous to the expanding United States. And the U.S. Army was beginning to take notice of just how dramatically the strategic balance had shifted. The Red River War was coming, and it would test every innovation, every adaptation, every clever modification that tribal engineers had developed. The question wasn't whether Yellow Wolf's travois could help plains tribes move faster, it was whether it could help them outrun the end of their world. The Red River War of 1874 wasn't just another Indian conflict, USS. It was the final exam for everything Yellow Wolf had created, and the U.S. Army had been studying. Colonel Ranald Mackenzie of the 4th Cavalry was nobody's fool. This was a man who had lost 2 fingers and been wounded 6 times in the Civil War, who understood logistics and mobility better than most generals. When his scouts started reporting Comanche war parties that could appear and disappear like ghosts, covering distances that should have been impossible, Mackenzie didn't dismiss it as frontier exaggeration. He investigated. What he discovered terrified him. The traditional military doctrine for fighting Plains Indians had always relied on one simple principle. Eventually, you could catch them because they moved slowly. Women, children, elderly tribal members, sacred objects, food supplies, all of this, had to be transported on travois that moved at the speed of a walking horse. Pin down the village, and you had won. But Yellow Wolf's innovation had shattered that equation. Mackenzie's response was brilliant and ruthless. If you can't catch the villages, make it impossible for them to run. He began targeting travois horses specifically, understanding that immobilized families meant inevitable surrender. His cavalry units carried orders to shoot, horses first, warriors second. It was a strategy that would make modern military ethicists cringe, but in the context of 1874, it was devastatingly effective. The test came during the Palo Duro Canyon raid in September of 1874. Picture this. 1,400 cavalry troops descending into a canyon where multiple bands had gathered for what they thought was a safe winter camp. The attack came at dawn, when fog still clung to the canyon walls, and most of the warriors were away on hunting parties. What followed was one of the most remarkable retreats in military history. As cavalry bugles echoed off the limestone walls and gunfire erupted throughout the camp, mothers were strapping infants into racing travois, while fathers fought desperate rearguard actions. The sight was something that burned itself into the memory of everyone who witnessed it. 60 travois, streaming up narrow canyon trails like a river of people defying gravity itself. 10-year-old Morning Star, who lived to be 93 and told this story to anthropologists in the 1940s, remembered it as the most terrifying and beautiful thing she had ever seen. Imagine trying to evacuate a modern city using nothing but motorcycles and stretchers, racing up mountain roads while under fire, and you begin to get a sense of what these families accomplished. The travois saved them, but barely. Yellow Wolf's flexible design allowed the fleeing families to navigate trails that would have destroyed traditional rigid pole travois. Women who had never considered themselves warriors found themselves making split-second engineering decisions. Which path could handle the weight, how to redistribute loads while under fire, when to abandon heavy items to save lives. But the army was learning too. Mackenzie's scouts, many of them Tonkawa Indians who understood travois construction intimately, began developing what they called travois traps, attacks timed and positioned, to catch fleeing families at water sources where the heavy frames would bog down in mud. They knew exactly which straps to cut to disable a travois permanently, which components were irreplaceable in the field. The psychological warfare was just as brutal as the physical. Cavalry units would deliberately target the magnificent decorated travois of war chiefs, understanding that destroying these symbols would demoralize entire bands. When they captured examples of Yellow Wolf's design, army engineers studied them like captured enemy weapons, looking for weaknesses they could exploit. Yet even as the military situation deteriorated, the travois continued to offer something precious: dignity. When Chief White Antelope's band faced starvation in the terrible winter of 1875, trapped between pursuing cavalry and a landscape stripped bare by drought, their swift travois allowed them to surrender on their own terms rather than being captured like animals. They rode into Fort Sill with their heads high, their sacred objects secure, their wounded properly cared for. It was surrender, but it was surrender as free people choosing their fate rather than victims overwhelmed by superior force. The most heartbreaking use of Yellow Wolf's innovation came during what tribal historians call the final flights. Those desperate journeys when families realized they would never return to their traditional lands. Travois that had once carried war loot and hunting spoils now carried sacred objects and ancestral bundles that families knew they might never be able to display again. Think about that for a moment. You're loading onto a travois everything that connects your people to their ancestors, TTAG. Medicine bundles blessed by generations of holy men, scalps taken by your grandfather's grandfather, sacred stones that mark your family's spiritual obligations. You know you're carrying these things to a reservation where Indian agents might confiscate them as pagan relics. But the travois makes it possible to bring them anyway, to maintain that connection even in exile. Yellow Wolf himself, now 41 and bearing scars from a dozen battles, modified his design one last time during this period. His grandmother, White Dove, was dying but had expressed one final wish. She wanted her bones to rest wherever her people would live, not in the ancestral burial grounds that were now behind cavalry lines. So Windwalker built what might have been the most sacred travois in Comanche history, a funeral platform that could carry White Dove's body and grave goods to whatever reservation land the government assigned them. It was engineering in service of love, technology preserving dignity even in defeat. The other tribes took notice. Apache bands in the mountains of New Mexico began using modified travois to carry their dead to hidden burial sites that government agents couldn't find. Cheyenne families loaded their most precious possessions onto travois and headed north toward Canada, hoping to join Sitting Bull's refugees. The design that had begun as Yellow Wolf's desperate vision for saving wounded warriors had become the vehicle for preserving entire cultures. But here's what's truly remarkable. Even as the free-roaming days ended, even as the last war chiefs surrendered their weapons, the travois refused to die. If anything, the reservation period would prove that Yellow Wolf's greatest innovation wasn't just about speed or efficiency, PPHP, it was about adaptability. The same flexible design principles that had allowed families to escape cavalry charges would soon help them navigate an entirely different kind of challenge. Survival in a world that seemed determined to erase every trace of who they had been. And in that struggle, Windwalker's fool's burden would prove to be anything but foolish. Here's something that would have amazed and probably terrified government officials in 1876. Yellow Wolf's travois didn't just survive the reservation system, do no harm. It evolved, adapted, and ultimately outlived the empire that tried to suppress it. Think about the challenge these families faced. You've been forced onto reservation land where Indian agents are actively trying to destroy your culture. Speaking your native language gets children beaten in government schools. Practicing traditional religion is illegal. Carrying weapons means imprisonment. Every aspect of your identity is under attack by people who genuinely believe they're saving your soul by destroying your heritage. But nobody thought to ban travois construction. Former warriors, men who had once led charges against cavalry units, found themselves teaching 8-year-old boys how to select willow branches and weave buffalo sinew. These weren't just construction lessons, they were acts of cultural resistance disguised as grandfather-grandson bonding time. Every time an old warrior showed a young boy how to distribute weight across a flexible frame, he was passing on principles of engineering, physics, and problem-solving that had kept their people alive for generations. By 1885, Indian agents were filing bemused reports about toy races at tribal gatherings. What they didn't understand was that these weren't toys. They were fully functional scale models of military technology, being tested and refined by children who would grow up to be the cultural bridge between the old world and the new. Yellow Wolf himself, now known throughout the reservation as Old Windwalker, served as judge and storyteller at these events. Picture this elderly man, his hair gone white, his hands still steady enough to demonstrate proper lashing techniques, surrounded by children and grandchildren who hung on every word of his stories. He would tell them about the night he saw horses running like the wind, about the day he saved Spotted Eagle, about the great retreat from Palo Duro Canyon. But more importantly, he was teaching them that innovation and tradition weren't opposites, they were partners. The really brilliant evolution came through his daughter, Blue Morning. This remarkable woman, born in the last years of the free-roaming period, grew up bilingual and bicultural in ways her father never could be. In 1903, She did something that modern marketing executives would recognize as pure genius. She revolutionized Yellow Wolf's design for the Wild West show circuit. Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and similar entertainments were huge business in the early 1900s, touring America and Europe with romanticized versions of frontier life. Blue Morning realized that these shows needed authentic props and equipment, and she began producing ceremonial travois that told her father's story to audiences worldwide. These weren't just museum pieces. They were functional demonstrations of indigenous engineering that drew gasps of amazement from crowds who had never seen anything move so smoothly and swiftly. Think about what she accomplished. At a time when popular culture portrayed Native Americans as primitive and backwards, Blue Morning was showcasing sophisticated technology that made European and American audiences rethink their assumptions. She was getting paid to preserve and spread her father's innovations while educating the same people who had conquered her homeland. The design kept evolving in ways that would have made Yellow Wolf proud. During World War I, Comanche code talkers brought travois-inspired stretcher designs to French battlefields. These weren't exact copies of the original design, but they incorporated the same principles of flexibility and weight distribution that Yellow Wolf had discovered in his peyote vision 50 years earlier. American medics using these stretchers could evacuate wounded soldiers from terrain that would have been impossible with rigid stretchers. Picture that. Comanche engineering principles, saving American lives in the trenches of France, while the sons and grandsons of cavalry officers who had chased Yellow Wolf across Texas were learning to appreciate indigenous innovation under the most desperate circumstances imaginable. The 1960s brought something nobody could have predicted. The travois became a symbol of indigenous pride during the cultural revitalization movements. Yellow Wolf's great-grandson, James Yellowfish, began teaching traditional construction techniques at newly established tribal colleges. Students who might have become engineers or architects were learning to think about design and materials in ways their professors had never considered. Modern aerospace engineers started taking notice. The same principles that allowed Yellow Wolf's travois to flex and bend without breaking were showing up in research papers about space vehicle design. The weight distribution systems that Comanche women had perfected for carrying household goods were being studied by logistics companies trying to improve cargo handling. But the real vindication came in the form of the Yellow Wolf Memorial Travois Race, established in 1978 at the annual Comanche Nation Fair. This isn't some quaint historical reenactment. We're talking about hundreds of participants and thousands of spectators, watching modern racers thunder past grandstands on travois that incorporate both traditional techniques and modern materials. The engineering has evolved, of course. Modern racers use lightweight alloys and synthetic materials that Yellow Wolf never could have imagined. But the core principles remain unchanged: flexibility over rigidity, distributed weight over concentrated loads, adaptation over resistance to change. Contemporary artists have embraced the travois as a symbol that bridges traditional and modern worlds. You'll find travois imagery in everything from museum sculptures to hip-hop music videos, often used to represent indigenous innovation and survival. The crazy idea that Greybeard once called the fool's burden has become an icon of Native American ingenuity. Today, if you visit the Comanche Nation Cultural Center, you can see Yellow Wolf's original sketches preserved under glass, alongside modern CAD drawings that demonstrate the mathematical principles he discovered through pure observation and necessity. Engineers from NASA and Boeing have toured the facility, studying designs that predate their organizations by more than a century. But here's what really gets me about this story. It's not finished. When modern Comanche racers thunder past those grandstands, their travois cutting through air like their ancestors cut through grass, they're carrying more than tradition. They're carrying proof that innovation born from desperation and vision can survive any empire's rise and fall. The United States Army that once specifically targeted travois horses is long gone, replaced by military institutions that study Yellow Wolf's designs for insights into mobile logistics. The reservation system that tried to destroy indigenous culture has given way to tribal sovereignty movements that celebrate exactly the kind of adaptive innovation that made Windwalker famous. The government officials who thought they could erase Comanche identity by confining them to reservations never imagined that a young warrior's fever dream would outlast their entire civilization. They couldn't conceive that flexible thinking might prove more durable than rigid institutions, that adaptation might triumph over conquest. Yellow Wolf died in 1912, surrounded by children and grandchildren who carried his stories forward. But in a very real sense, Windwalker is still running. Every time someone chooses innovation over tradition, flexibility over rigidity, creative problem-solving over conventional wisdom, they're following the path he carved through the prairie grass of 1867. The travois that began as a desperate solution to an impossible military problem has become something far more profound. Proof that the human capacity for innovation, adaptation, and survival can outlast any attempt to suppress it. And somewhere in the wind that still sweeps across the southern plains, you can almost hear the sound of ghost horses running, carrying the dreams of a young warrior who refused to accept that the impossible had to stay impossible, the fool's burden. Indeed. But history has a way of revealing who the real fools were, doesn't it?